Buenas noches a todos. Estamos aquí reunidos gracias a Designs for Health, que es la marca de nuestros productos de grado profesional que usamos en la práctica clínica de la mayoría de nosotros en medicina funcional y diferentes especialidades, digamos, a lo largo del país. Vamos hoy a hablar sobre omega 3. Y tenemos aquí al doctor Dan Kalish, que es uno de los líderes de medicina funcional en los Estados Unidos. Entonces, de ahora en adelante hablaremos en inglés. So it is with great honor that I introduce Dr. Dan Kalish. He is the founder of the Kalish Institute for Functional Medicine. He is our speaker tonight and will present the most current information on essential fatty acids, metabolism, sources, signs of deficiency, clinical applications, importance about purity of the supplements used, contraindications, and more. Dr. Kalish has trained over 5,000 practitioners on how to build successful functional medicine practices. He teaches clinical applications and patient communication techniques through hands-on and case-based approaches. He has published research with Mayo Clinic, has authored 3 books on functional medicine, and is a notable speaker in all of integrative medicine conferences. So thank you, Dr. Kalish, for being with us tonight, and let's get started.
Oh yeah, thank you very much for hosting this. Very excited to be here and talking about omega 3s in clinical practice. So let's just get into the lecture. So I want to do a talk for 30 or 40 minutes and then show you some cases and examples of labs, and then we'll talk about questions and answers at the end. So a lot of the work that I'm going to present tonight is based on the research of a man named Richard Lord. So Dr. Lord, as a scientist, he's still alive, is in his 80s now, and he was the original scientist that started to run fatty acid testing that we're going to talk about tonight. He also was the pioneer in amino acid testing. He's the scientist that developed all the organic acid testing that we use in the industry now. He also developed some of the original GI microbiome tests. And he's quite the expert on combining and integrating biochemistry and physiology and how things work in the cells with a practical application of this work in terms of interpreting labs. And so I want to present today a little bit about the pathways and how things work in your body, and then we can segue over to the labs and how you can see these pathways either working or not working in terms of fatty acids on the lab testing. And that's where this work gets really exciting. Oh, and just to let you all know, we have a long haul syndrome and cardiometabolic health boot camp coming up at the Kalish Institute. Any of you that are interested, you get 20% off with this Designs for Health discount. And so that gets very deep into fatty acids and lipids and all the things that have to do with cardiometabolic health. So that's coming up in a few weeks. If you guys are interested, you can contact us. Okay, so now, and all the classes that I teach are online. Now, we're going to talk a little bit about fatty acids. Assume that maybe you either learned about this a long time ago and kind of forgot, or haven't studied the fatty acids too much. Talk a little bit about conditions and then get into the lab testing. And there's probably there's like 64 slides. There's probably 40 slides in this slideshow that we're actually not going to go into detail on, but they're there for your reference, and I'll provide the slides to your group after the talk. And they're just so you can look things up later. And I think that when we're doing talks like this, it doesn't help to just throw a bunch of facts at you that you try to memorize quickly. What seems to work better for clinicians is if we actually teach you a skill, because then you can use that skill with patients, and you can always look up the facts later. So I'm going to skip through a lot of these slides or just mention them briefly, but you can look at them later. So don't worry, you're not going to miss anything. Okay, so let's start off with an introduction to fatty acids. And this is the most obvious thing, is what are the problems that you would even think about that are related to fatty acids? So why would you think about testing somebody or prescribing fatty acids? Symptoms like depression and fatigue are kind of obvious. Weakened immune response, anxiety, poor wound healing. You see these in practice all the time, and you also see very frequently fatty acid deficiencies that accompany these. If you think about it from the biggest picture, fatty acids are what make up every cell membrane. So these are the and also membranes of structures like the mitochondria. So every neuron has a huge membrane around it. Every mitochondria has two membranes, an inner and outer membrane. So literally every single cell in the body and the organelles as well, like mitochondria, are completely reliant upon the right amount and the right type of fatty acids in order for them to do their job. Okay, and then we also use fatty acids to make things besides cell membranes, to make things like all the hormones that are steroid hormones and things like that. So you'll see conditions ranging from hormone-related problems to neurological problems, endocrine. Of course, the fatty acids are probably the best known for their role in reducing inflammation, the omega-3s, and their role in helping prevent cardiovascular disease. But you can also use them for really just sort of basic cosmetic issues like people that have dry skin, I mean, so the range here is pretty wide in terms of the application. You don't really think about fatty acids in terms of sleep, but it's very common for people with low omega-6 fatty acids to get into or not be able to get into deeper sleep states. So it's not just the omega-3s that are important, the omega-6s are equally important, and we'll go through a bunch of diagrams on that. Of course, diet plays a role, and it's sort of assumed at a lecture like this where we're talking about labs that you're going to be getting the person to eat healthy food and that you understand, what foods are rich in omega-3s and what foods are rich in omega-6s and how to get somebody to eat nuts and seeds and salmon and flax seeds and all the things that are full of these fatty acids. So again, there's this huge assumption that the diet has been controlled for, and we're looking for when that's not enough. So lifestyle coaching always comes first, and you do that lifestyle coaching in terms of dietary advice. And then when that's not enough and that's not working, and then you start to look a little deeper into what the problem may be. You will find in a majority of people that have fatty acid imbalances that there's a role of digestion and absorption of fats in the problem. There's a direct relationship between your gallbladder, how well your gallbladder is functioning, not just what kind of fats you're eating, but how well your digestive system and your digestive tract can break them down. So the most common thing we see obviously is that there's a gallbladder issue and bile is not, flowing through the system very well. And so the person can't emulsify and break down their fats. You'll also see people with GI infections of all types, whether it's an overgrowth of bacteria like SIBO would be classic, or you could have something like Giardia or Cryptosporidium or H. pylori that's going to interfere with fat absorption as well. And so we always recommend, in addition to lifestyle coaching, that you do a GI test. And you couldn't really do a good fatty acid program unless you know the status of the person's gut health. So again, these are huge assumptions. You're doing the lifestyle coaching, you're doing a digestive panel, because it's, I don't know, embarrassing isn't the right word, but it's frustrating to be a year into a case and you're wondering why this person keeps needing to take these fatty acids. Maybe they've gotten some help from them or not enough. It's not making sense to you. And then you run the digestive panel and find out that the gallbladder is messed up and the whole problem, could have been addressed through fixing the gut. So when you have these extreme deficiencies, it's not enough just to give the fatty acids that are missing. You need to track back and see where this problem came from. So in my clinic and in all the doctors that we train in my mentorship program, pretty much everybody does a GI test on every patient. And you guys have access to the GI map, which is considered in the US really to be the state-of-the-art, best of its class test right now. For sure, I was looking at tests the other day in my mentorship, trying to pull up examples for a different class. And it's like 80% of the labs that we get in my classes are GI map. So that's the test. It has a specific marker for gallbladder function as well. So that's the way that you would screen, for people. And then there's also this issue around micronutrient imbalances. And this is a daunting slide, but once you look at this for like 8, 9, maybe 10 years, it starts to make sense. Okay. But you kind of got to memorize this at some point, okay? So you got the omega-3s over here, and then the omega-6s here. And so you eat them, obviously, but your body also makes them. And so the eating of them is obvious dietary coaching. But what we're really worried about is the percentage of patients that we have that can't convert one fatty acid to the other. And why would that happen? Because there's a problem that can develop with these different enzymes, like this enzyme right here called delta 6 desaturase. See it? It says right in the little bubble there, inhibited by age or alcohol. Some people also just have a genetic defect, so this enzyme, delta 6, doesn't work very well, which means that they cannot take this fat and make that fat. So you have to have the enzyme to convert ALA to that fat, and you have to have that same enzyme to convert linoleic to GLA. And again, if this enzyme's not working, your body doesn't make these downstream fatty acids. And it's very common to see these enzymes not working. And there's a whole bunch of these enzymes, delta 6, elongase, delta 5, desaturase. And then here you see the actual fatty acids that you're familiar with. EPA, eicosapentaenoic, is pretty famous. DHA, that's the one that's related to the brain. It's really important for the brain. Arachidonic is, famous for being pro-inflammatory. So a lot of these you may have heard of, but the point of this whole slide is that you need to make these fatty acids in this pathway, the omega-3s and the omega-6s, and it requires these enzymes to work to do that. And guess what? These enzymes are dependent on a series of nutrients, including magnesium and some of the B vitamins and zinc. And so you can have a simple nutritional deficiency. Let's say you drink too much alcohol and your zinc levels are really low, or your B vitamin levels are low. That's an even better example. You drink too much alcohol, your B vitamin levels are low, and so now it doesn't matter what you're eating and how healthy your diet is, you're not being able to convert or produce these fatty acids because the enzymes aren't working because you don't have the vitamins you need to make them work. So that's a big issue, and part of getting fatty acids to work properly is to make sure that people are on a good quality multivitamin that has all the basic vitamins and minerals that you need to run these pathways. And that seems a little complicated, but this happens a lot in the practice, and so you don't want to miss that one. So we get the fatty acids from diet, but we also make them, and that is an important thing to consider. Because we call them essential fatty acids, most people just assume that they're all from the diet, but they're not really. The diet you can control easily, but the problem with the patients that we usually treat is that the conversions aren't working well. And here's a simple list, and again, you can you'll have copies of this to look at later. But these are food sources for the different fatty acids. I recommend flax seeds for most people because you can see the content of linolenic acid is so high in flax seeds. It's quite an easy way to get people a lot of those particular fatty acids. And then here's food sources for EPA, which we're all familiar with. Salmon is at the top of the list, sardines and these kinds of fish. Now, some people may not like to eat fish, or it's popular now in the United States, people are vegans and vegans don't eat fish. So you can get omega-3s and omega-6s from non-animal sources, definitely, if you need to. And there's plenty of companies that sell non-animal sourced omega-3s and 6s. But anyways, this is the idea of doing it with food. But now here's where we get tripped up. And I'm going to just circle the ones that you kind of need to know. And when we look at the labs, this is going to make a little more sense. So you really need to know on the omega-6 side about GLA. So linoleic converts into GLA. And GLA is very important for hormone balancing, for sleep quality. It's a very important omega-6 fatty acid. Arachidonic is the inflammatory one that gets all the bad press, but you need the GLA to be balanced out. On the omega-3 side, you start off with this one here, linolenic, but the ones that are famous, again, are EPA, and that you'll see on the label of the supplement bottle, EPA, and how much of the EPA is in there, and very famous DHA. Okay, and those two are usually present together in most omega-3 capsules. And you want to make sure that you use a reputable company because obviously fish oil can be contaminated with mercury, and you don't want to give your patients a pill that has a bunch of mercury in it. That would be counterproductive. So you got to make sure you're getting your good quality fatty acids. And the companies like Designs for Health spend a lot of time and money making sure that they can source omega-3s that are toxin free. And that's one of the things that we like about these companies, right? These professional brands, that's sort of their goal, is to make sure that they're getting good quality products that we can use that are not going to make our patients sick. And there's also in my industry, you know, because we all do lab testing. So I run a lab test, they're low in omega-3s, I give them a good quality omega-3 from Designs for Health, and guess what? I retest people. So this has been going on for 40 or 50 years in the United States. And so these companies like Designs are held to a very high standard because they have thousands of doctors that are testing their products literally every day on our patients. And we're not just testing them to see if it worked in terms of the patient feeling better, but we're looking at repeat lab testing. And so they have to have a high standard or their whole business model would fall apart. And you will see if you do repeat lab testing how well these products work compared to a poor quality fatty acid that could actually make someone worse if it's full of contaminants. Now here, we're thinking about like, why are these fatty acids so important? This is probably the main reason why they're important, because they make up the structure of membranes. And here, I'll just show you this really quick, because again, we all learned this in school, but you kind of forget these things as the years roll by. So this is the phospholipid bilayer, famous phospholipid bilayer. And these little tail-looking things right in here are the fatty acids. And here you can see it has this hydrophilic head and then this hydrophobic tail. And so because the tails are hydrophobic, meaning they don't like water, they organize like this. It's kind of amazing. These fats, it's not like they're glued together, right? They're just kind of hanging out in a certain pattern because they don't like water. And there's water over here, and there's water over here, and so these things line up like this. And the membrane structure in the human body, it would, if you could feel it, if you could feel a bunch of cell membranes, they would feel roughly like olive oil. It's very fluid, it moves. It's not like a piece of butter that's solid at room temperature. It's more like olive oil. So the flexibility and the ability for these membranes to move and for proteins to lodge in these membranes and for substances to get in and out of these membranes, all of that function is dependent on which fatty acids are in here. So if you have poor quality fatty acids in your cell membranes, guess what? The whole cell suffers. Bad stuff gets in easily that shouldn't. Good stuff can't get in. Bad stuff can't get out of the cell. Like all the transport mechanisms that go in and out of the cell are going through the membrane. So membranes are really, really, really important for the normal functioning of the cell. And again, this is the fat portion right here. I don't think you could get a more important structure in the human body than the cell membrane, to be honest, because if they're not working well, every single cell in your body is going to suffer. So there's neurological impacts here, and EPA and DHA, there's thousands of studies. You know, about 10 years ago now, I worked for this group in Washington, D.C. It was called the One Mind for Research. It was this new startup that was started by the Kennedy family and by Harvard University, and they were looking at, you know, solutions for brain injury. And there was a very famous researcher that I worked with for a year or two. His whole careers have been focused on omega-3 fatty acids and how they impact the brain. More research on this than you could ever read. It's a very, very well understood process that if you have poor quality fatty acids or not enough fatty acids, your brain is going to suffer. And again, EPA and DHA are the solution. And when you look at the labs in a moment, you'll see that you can measure these so you're not guessing. There's also the anti-inflammatory and immune modulating roles of these fatty acids. And you can see here, this is something you might want to study later. I think it's kind of interesting. But if you look at, especially on the omega-6 side, how many immune processes are related and how many inflammatory processes are related to the omega-3s and omega-6s. There's an incredible amount of inflammation that you can reduce and an incredible amount of immune stimulation and immune balancing you can do with these omega-3s and omega-6s. And you don't have to guess about this. You know, you can do this based on testing. So in terms of the different conditions, I'd recommend if you really get into this and you really get into the lab testing, there's a wonderful book. It's by Richard Lord that I talked about at the beginning. It's called Laboratory Guides to Health. And you can get that as an iBook, if you have a Mac or an iPhone type device. You can also get it as a Google book. So anyways, Laboratory Guides to Health. There's a lot of information in there about fatty acids. There's a whole probably 150-page chapter about them. So when we think about, in most countries, I don't know if it's true in Costa Rica, I haven't studied your demographics, but at least in the United States, for sure, leading cause of death and really the leading cause of unnecessary early deaths is directly related to cardiometabolic diseases and what's happening with fatty acids and muscle tissue. And so when I think about that as a way of preventing people from dying too early, but then also about on the positive, like what's the most impactful way that you can extend lifespan, to do something proactive for your patients so that they live longer and are healthier, and not only live a longer period of time, but that as they're in their 70s, 80s, and 90s, they're healthy and functional. And is there a mechanism that we could stimulate to make all that happen? And it turns out that omega-3s and omega-6s play a very strong role in all of these variables. And I'll show you a little bit about this. And these are just some studies. Again, you can look at these later if you want. Early protection against sudden death. And this is a quote from Richard's book here, which is a nice one. In large epidemiological studies, omega-3 fatty acids were associated with significant reductions in mortality, cardiovascular disease mortality, cardiovascular and sudden death, even in those patients with no history of cardiac disease. So again, there's all kinds of studies there. There's a few citations there, more than you could ever read about all this. So on the prevention side, omega-3s play a strong role. And in fact, in order to give someone an omega-3 for prevention, you don't have to do the lab testing that we're talking about tonight. And these studies don't do any of the lab work at all. They're just giving people omega-3s and seeing what happens to their mood and personality and behavior and what happens to their risk of sudden death. Turns out that all these things are improved when we give fatty acids. And that's, again, very simplistically without any lab testing at all. So you can use these products to help prevent premature death very successfully without doing any of the lab testing. And I do want to mention that when you get into the lab work, you're going to see how important the 6s are. So we don't want to just treat with the 3s. So there's also some work you can look at later on looking at high triglycerides, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, and athletes. So I'm going to talk about athletes a little bit because I think this is on the proactive side. If we're talking about you can use fatty acids to prevent high triglycerides or to reverse them, to prevent sudden cardiac death, to reverse cardiovascular disease once it's developed, and all these wonderful things that are along the lines of preventing someone from dying. What about just proactively making someone really healthy? And what's the most important thing that you can do there? And that would be to stimulate muscle growth and to stimulate something called mTOR. So mTOR is used by many. The idea of mTOR has been sort of batted around mostly by longevity doctors that are looking to prevent cancer, and they actually try to inhibit mTOR. There's a whole, scientific, field around that. But what we're talking about here is actually wanting to put more muscle mass on somebody, because the role of muscle mass in all-cause mortality is pretty profound. And there's a group of scientists I've been following for the last year or two. It's quite amazing. It's the number, sarcopenia or muscle loss is the #1 determinant of when we're going to die. If you look at all the different things that you can see, whether you're smoking, whether you're drinking, whether you exercise or not, it's muscle mass that turns out to be the #1 determinant of all-cause mortality. And so if you have low muscle mass, you're at high risk for dying younger, regardless of what age you are. And as obviously as people get older, this becomes a bigger and bigger problem. So another thing that you want to think about is what are the roles in muscle function with omega-3s? And you'll see that with athletes that do activities like rock climbing or some repetitive sports like cycling, when you're cycling up a hill, that fatty acids will improve muscle performance quite dramatically. But fatty acids will also improve muscle mass, and muscle mass is one of the most important factors in how long we're going to live. So both from a prevention of early death and from an extension of life or longevity, fatty acids make a lot of sense. And again, everything that we're talking about up to now is about research done without any lab testing. So I want to shift gears in just a minute and get into the lab work, okay? And here's some other studies you can look at that cite some of these things, okay? Also in insulin resistance. This is really important. You couldn't get more important than this in terms of how, as you know, when we're insulin resistant, we become inflamed, oxidative stress levels go up. You're then at risk for developing prediabetes or diabetes. You develop a high risk for developing high triglycerides, high risk for developing any kind of cardiometabolic syndrome, obesity, cardiovascular disease, arterial plaquing, all of that. And so fatty acids play another profound role in terms of helping reverse insulin resistance. And as I mentioned a moment ago, in terms of another study here on muscle protein synthesis in older adults. So there's a diagram about how this all actually works. We probably don't need to know, it's a little technical. Muscle mass, the brain, talked about a little bit, rheumatoid arthritis. Again, these are studies you can look at later if you want. Crohn's disease, this sort of mixed findings on Crohn's disease and mixed findings on asthma. Depression, the research is pretty clear that and very positive. But you know, one of the problems that I have with the research on asthma, on Crohn's disease, on rheumatoid arthritis that's mixed is that they're not doing any lab testing. So they're just taking populations of people with RA or populations of people with Crohn's disease and then seeing how they respond to fatty acids. But almost by definition, not everybody in a study is going to have a fatty acid deficiency. So one would think that people that have the fatty acid deficiencies are going to respond in a much different way. So when a lot of the research that's done is using fatty acids as if they're a drug. So you're not really assessing the nutritional status of the person first, you're just giving a whole group of people fatty acids and seeing how they respond. And when you get into the testing aspect of the work, then you're only giving people fatty acids who are deficient in them, and that completely changes the outcomes. And there's not a lot of research on that yet. There may be someday, but not yet. So there are some things to be very careful of, and this has come up in class just this morning or yesterday. I don't know, it was a long day today. I think the class was this morning. We were talking about, there's a patient that someone was presenting who's on blood thinners, and we had this whole deep sigh, everybody said, oh, what are we gonna do about that? We know what are the things that you can and can't do. And so you have to be very careful when people are on medications, and there's entire books devoted to this. There's the Drug Nutrient Handbook. If you don't have a copy of that, you should definitely pick one up, the Drug Nutrient Handbook. And that goes through each medication and then what nutrients are contraindicated given a certain health condition or medication that the person may be on. But there's definitely issues with that. So you have to double check if people are on medications, what you're going to do. Now, in terms of adverse reactions, you know, the worst thing that I've ever heard in my practice is somebody burps up a little fish oil. They feel like it's a little unpleasant. And you get a fishy aftertaste, right? So there's not, and if you're fixing people's digestion, you're not going to get a lot of these reactions anyways, because most of those people that react poorly to fish oils have a big digestive problem. But we've already said that you're going to have fixed that by the time you get to this stage. And so I don't think you see much in the way of adverse reactions, but there are some situations with some medications that you need to avoid them. Okay? Immune suppression, that would be another category. And drug interactions. Again, you should pick up the book though, the Drug Nutrient Interaction Handbook, and that'll go through this in great detail. Now, there's a big problem with poor quality fish oils in particular. I don't think it's a problem with the omega-6s because fish are so contaminated in general. So you definitely have to rely on these companies to do the right thing. And you know, for companies like Designs for Health, I've actually been to their factory. I've seen their production line. I know all the people that work in the company quite well. And a lot of this is based on us trusting these companies and making sure that they're submitting the data that they need. So you can check if you're curious and look at all their stringent requirements for quality control. And making sure that the company that's receiving a bad batch of fish oil is going to analyze it and send it back to the manufacturer and say, hey, we're not going to put that in our product line. And that's one of the things that Designs for Health has been very famous for doing. For the last, I've been a client of theirs for 30 years, if you can believe that. I've been using Designs for Health for 30 years. That kind of dates me a little bit, but. Now, another thing, you're gonna see this on the lab test, this is one of my favorite lab markers, is lipid peroxides. So lipid peroxides, it's the oxidation or damage that's happening to a lipid. And this is super important. So it's important on the supplement side because you obviously don't want to give somebody a fatty acid that's rancid or gone bad. And so companies have different ways of trying to deal with this to make sure that they're getting you a fresh, high quality fatty acid. But you'll also see on the lab test that you can measure lipid peroxidation in your patients. And that plays a really strong role in how you're going to start to correct their fatty acid imbalances. Short version of the story is that if you have a person that has high lipid peroxides on the test, it means that there's a lot of oxidative stress hitting the lipids or fats. So if you then dump in a whole bunch of omega-3 or omega-6 fatty acids, guess what? They're going to get oxidized or damaged, and you don't want that to happen. So it's not just that these products can get oxidized during manufacturing in the cheaper quality brands. The product, the fatty acid, can get oxidized in the patient's body if their lipid peroxides are high. And so how do we defend against that? It's very important. Otherwise, everything's going to get messed up. You use fat-soluble antioxidants. The famous ones was mentioned here, vitamin E, as well as CoQ10. So CoQ10 is quite something. It's a nutrient, but it's 50 carbons long. It's massive length. Most of these fats that we're talking about that are in the cell membrane are only 16 carbons long. So CoQ10 is like 3 times longer than a fatty acid. It has 3 times more carbons. It's more lipid friendly than the fats that we're talking about. And the cool thing about CoQ10, this is a study that was done a while ago on where it's localized. Guess what? That's it right there. This is from the study localization of CoQ10 in lipid membranes. The blue thing there is the CoQ10. So if we're saying one of the most important features of fatty acids is that they make up your cell membrane. Here's your membrane. Here's your fatty acid right here. Here's your other fatty acid right there. There's like the outside of the cell is here, the inside of the cell is there. That right there, the kind of blue purple looking thing, is a CoQ10 molecule. It gets right into the center of the membrane and it goes lengthwise that way because it's longer than the actual membrane is wide. And guess what? It's a very powerful fat-soluble antioxidant. So it protects these cell membranes against lipid peroxidation, against oxidative stress. So that's important because you don't want to give fatty acids and have them damaged. It'll make the person worse. Okay, so let's take a peek at some lab testing. And then I have some real lab examples too. So here's the same diagram over and over just to get you familiar. Omega-3s, omega-6s. Now we're going to measure them. Okay, so linolenic, you see these in the list there. That is going to translate into, let me show you. I'm going to skip ahead and I'll come back. Here. Here's an actual example of a test. Those are the fatty acids that we've been looking at this whole time. Let me skip back a little bit. There we go. Okay, so, and this is from Dr. Lord's book, Interpretation of Lab Results is Simplified by Considering Clinical Conditions Rather than Individual Analytes, ... And he's got 7 steps of interpretation for fatty acids. Is there a general fatty acid deficiency? That could be a gallbladder problem or a diet problem. Is there an omega-3 deficiency or an excess of omega-3? One thing to keep in mind is that long-term use of omega-3 or fish oils will deplete your omega-6s. Remember those enzymes that I was showing you a minute ago? It's the same enzyme works for the 3's and the 6's. If you take a lot of 3's, omega-3s, you're going to monopolize the enzyme and you won't make as many omega-6s. So common scenario, patient comes in, patient says, I'm super healthy, I don't want to have a heart attack, I want to live forever, I take fish oil every day. So you look at the quality of the fish oil and you go, wow, this is a really poor quality fish oil. This is rancid, it's oxidized, and you're just thinking, this is dangerous. I wouldn't be taking this if you paid me. So number one, they're on a poor quality product. And then number two, they've been taking fish oil for like 20 years and they never took any omega-6s to balance it out. So you run the lab and guess what? They have high omega-3s and low omega-6s. That happens a lot. So again, when you're looking at the labs, item number 3, you're looking for omega-6 deficiency or excess. And then we also talked about micronutrient deficiencies, genetic disorders. It's pretty complicated. But the most common thing that you see actually are the genetic disorders where the person can't make fatty acids properly because of the way they were born. There's also a very famous marker called the omega-3 index, and that's defined as the amount of EPA that I mentioned, eicosapentaenoic, plus DHA in the membranes, expressed as a percent of the total red blood cell membrane fatty acids. And so the omega-3 index is something that's done in outside of functional medicine even. I mean, it's in a lot of the functional medicine labs, but it's something that's done. I know a lot of family practitioners and primary care docs in the United States that use this test quite often as a biomarker for cardiovascular disease risk factors. Okay. So that's another one to know about. Now, as we're about to look at these labs, what are the things that are determining the fatty acid levels that we're measuring? Diet is number one. You kind of have to put diet first because that's the first thing that you should try to fix. Genetics is huge though. So some people don't, those enzymes that we looked at, the delta 6, delta 5, desaturases, all these things, some people have SNPs or genetic flaws in how those enzymes are working. So they don't make fatty acids very well. You can very clearly see that on the lab. And then I mentioned a minute ago, over supplementation with omega-3s can deplete omega-6s. And then any nutrient can be a toxicant. You can take too much of anything. That's why we do the labs. So when we're looking at the tests, it's a little confusing and overwhelming, but I'm just going to point out a few things. The 3s and the 6s, lipid peroxides, that's whether the lipids are being oxidized or damaged. So oxidation is like the process if you cut an apple in half and it starts to turn brown, it's oxidizing. Or if you see a nail outside and or a car that's been outside for a long time and it's starting to rust, that's oxidation. It's the process of oxygen damaging something. So lipid peroxides are a measure of lipids being oxidized or damaged. So it's very important to see not just what the lipid levels are, but how healthy are the lipids. And then the fat soluble antioxidants like CoQ10, vitamin E, beta carotene, those are the nutrients that protect lipids from being oxidized. And we saw that example of the CoQ10 in the membrane. It's in there like a guard, you know, protecting the cell membrane from oxidative stress. So let me pull up. I have these labs, but I have some better examples. And then I threw these charts in here for later for you guys if you're like just wondering. If any of you really get into the lab work, these are helpful charts. These are all from Dr. Lord's book, but it may stimulate some thoughts later once you do some labs. And there's also this book as well, A Handbook of Nutrient Assessments is a good book. Okay, so if you joined us late, we're having a cardiometabolic health boot camp starting in a few weeks. If you're really interested in lipids and learning more about this and how to correct these problems, this is a lab interpretation, lab-based class. We're also talking about long haul syndrome because that's a common complaint, but we're really focusing almost exclusively on cardiometabolic health. Okay, so you guys are interested, you get 20% off on that. And let me show you here some labs. Okay, so this is a Genova Nutraval. We're gonna work with your folks in Costa Rica to make sure you guys can get this test easily and affordably. And it tests many things, but I'm just gonna scoot down to the portion of the test that has the fatty acids because that's what we're talking about. Oh, but I'll show you this one other thing here. See that lipid peroxides? So now you know lipid peroxides, if that level is high, that means your membranes and your lipids throughout your body are getting oxidized. What does that do? That puts you high risk for cardiovascular disease, any kind of metabolic problem, and anything that you can imagine that happens because of a cell membrane, not going to work very well. Your brain's not going to work very well. Your heart's not going to work very well. Your liver's not going to work very well. So again, I'm going to skip down to the portion of the test that focuses on fatty acids, so you can see that. And you know, it's enough to just look at the 3s and 6s, and they're the most important anyway. So we're going to kind of ignore some of the other fatty acids for now. But I want you to see how you can visualize this. So there's your omega-3 fatty acids. And remember, we just talked about EPA. There's the patient's level of EPA. We talked about DHA, the one that's really good for your brain. There's the patient's level of DHA. Percent of omega-3s right there. And here's your omega-6s. So we talked about GLA as being really important. There's the patient's GLA level. Now we didn't talk about this one, DGLA, but this patient has low DGLA, borderline low arachidonic, and DTA is low. So interestingly, this patient has plenty of omega-3s and not enough omega-6s. So guess what? If you just ran a research study on Crohn's disease and this person was in that study and you gave them a bunch of omega-3s, would that make them healthier? No, not even a little bit, because they already have plenty of omega-3s. And remember, omega-3s compete with omega-6s. They're using the same enzymes. So if you gave this person a lot of omega-3s, their omega-6s would get even worse, and it would be bad for them. So we don't want to do that. And again, that's my so problem with a lot of the research studies is if they show a mixed result, you don't really know unless you have the lab work. You don't know why that happened. It may just be true that omega-3s don't help rheumatoid arthritis much, or it may be that they just gave the wrong things to the wrong people. So yeah, this is a good example. So this person you would want to give GLA to. The usual dose is around 250 milligrams twice a day. You can get it from borage oil or borage oil or evening primrose oil. All the companies carry a GLA product, and you'd want to give like 1 capsule twice a day as a minimum, and then redo the test in about 6 months. And remember, when the omega-6s get low, you can have major problems with REM sleep. People don't get into REM sleep very well, and so they get depressed, they get anxious, quality of their sleep is poor, can have a lot of cognitive effects. We know that the omega-3s, as I mentioned, tens of thousands of studies on omega-3 in the brain, but omega-6s in some ways are as important. The balance of these is really what's important. Okay, so that's a great example. And let's look at one more. Again, this is a NutraVal from Genova. And we'll kind of skip down. I just want to point on the things that were so many markers on here. Oh, here, this is convenient. So you see lipid peroxides are high on this patient. Little red arrow there. So that means there's a lot of lipids being damaged. Lipid peroxides are high, which is bad for your lipids. So now here, and I'll show you, here's the marker right here. And let me circle it for you so you can see. Well, that's kind of scary. If I did this lab and I saw my lipid peroxides were high, I would just like drop my computer right now and I would get in my car and drive somewhere and try to find some fat-soluble antioxidants. Because look, this is super high. Lipid peroxides are super high. What does that mean? It means that the lipids in this person's body are being oxidized at a rapid rate. It's like, I don't know, it's like having a cell, a beautiful, perfect cell that's happy and it should be on the beach and in the sun and, enjoying its life. And it's like someone's like stabbing it, with a shovel or something. It's getting damaged. It's physically getting damaged. Oxidative stress is a physical process. It's this lipids being ripped apart. And then what's going to happen to your membranes? What's going to happen to your brain? Not a good situation to be in. Okay, lipid peroxides high. This is extremely high. The reference range is up to 10. They're above the reference range. So right now, you've got a more important problem with this patient than what their 3s and 6s are like, because you got to get the lipid damage down. And how do you do that? Fat-soluble antioxidants. Which ones are they? Vitamin E, CoQ10, beta-carotene. So that's correctable. And then we're going to look at the fatty acids themselves. And here, it's not too complicated. I mean, it's intimidating, but not too. Look, alpha-linolenic is underneath the detected limit. That's very, very low. The other omega-3s are okay. So for this patient, for this individual human being, if you gave them the usual EPA, would that help them? Well, a little bit, but not really. See, the EPA is already good. If you gave them DHA, would that make up for this problem? Not really, because that's already fine. Remember, ALA, it's at that top of the pathway. The pathway goes down, doesn't go up. So you can't take DHA and go up. It's a one-way pathway down. So this person needs the ALA, not the EPA or DHA, and that's found in flaxseed. So fish oil would not help this person. They have a problem with ALA. And just as a quick refresher, let me show you here because this is a lot of information. I don't know. This is more of an introductory class, right? It's like you can't really learn all these things in one night. But here's another one of these diagrams. I keep showing these different versions. Hopefully one of these will stick in your brain here. Let me show you one more time what's going on with this patient specifically. So here, we just saw this person and we're thinking, I'm gonna give EPA to everybody. Well, they don't need EPA. I'm gonna give DHA because that's really good for your brain. Where their DHA levels were fine. Their ALA was low. And remember, these pathways go down, not up. So if you don't have enough ALA, alpha-linolenic acid, you have to give ALA to get it back to normal. And so in this case, you'd have to use something like flaxseed to get this better, because flax is very rich in ALA. And EPA and DHA are probably not going to hurt them, but they're not going to help. And for those of you that are wondering, when I said there are all these cofactors, here are the cofactors listed out. So in order to convert ALA down, you need B2, B3, B6, magnesium, vitamin C, zinc, insulin, all this stuff there. And insulin. So if your insulin is not balanced out, these fatty acids are going to have a problem. And the converse is true too. If you take the omega-3s, it improves insulin sensitivity. So sometimes it's a micronutrient problem, but this patient's a great example of why the testing is helpful. Okay, so omega-6s for this person. Well, DGLA is low. Let me circle this for you. If you're not used to all these terms, I think it can be a little overwhelming. DGLA is low, you can see that. Arachidonic is a little low, DTA is a little low. So typically if you see this pattern, nobody really has DGLA in a supplement form. So you would give GLA to get the conversion down to these others. Okay, so you give GLA to fix all these ones that are low below it. GLA, okay, would be the prescription, 250 milligrams twice a day. That'll start to feed these ones down here. And then over here, flaxseed oil or flaxseed to get the ALA back up. But remember, this person has a more important problem. They have very high lipid peroxides. So before you go dumping all these fatty acids into their system, you want to give them CoQ10 or vitamin E or both, I don't know, for a few days, for a few weeks, get the system a little healthier, then you could give the fatty acids, because you don't want to introduce a whole bunch of really wonderful fatty acids into a body that's oxidizing them. Obviously, that could potentially make the person worse. So every nutrient can be a toxicant. If you give a whole bunch of wonderful fatty acids and the person is destroying their fatty acids, it's not going to help. So you want to combine the fatty acids with fat-soluble antioxidants. Okay, I think we have time for one more, and then we can have some time for questions. So here's another NutriVal. Oh, and see on the, right on the display page here, you can see omega-3 index. That's what we talked about in the notes here. They also have these different ratios. You can, if you really get into this, you can study those. So we're kind of go through the lab. We're just looking for the things related to fats or lipids. But this is going to include cardiovascular disease prevention, ways to help your patients that have depression, people that have sleep disorders, patients that have inflammatory problems, patients that have skin problems, anxiety. I mean, there's pretty wide, obesity, anything to do with metabolic syndrome. So there's very broad application to what we're talking about. So this particular lab, the lipid peroxides are high, not as high as the last time, but lipid peroxides, they're in the yellow. So yellow means bad, but red means extra bad. So I can kind of scoot down here and tell you exactly how high it is. Lipid peroxides are a 7. I think on the last patient, it was a 14. Okay, so they're not great, but not nearly as dramatically off as the last one. So then we're going to go down to the fatty acids here. That doesn't look good. Yeah, it's amazing what happens to people, you know. I was talking with one of the lab people earlier today. We were just shaking our heads. We were looking at these sample labs, and we were both just like, I can't believe these people are alive. That's just incredible what happens to people. Okay, so this person is the opposite of the last one. Look, ALA is perfect. No flaxseed, no flaxseed. Don't even think about it. This person needs EPA and DHA, really low. These are all low. Look at that. The omega-3s are all low, but not ALA. So forget the flaxseed. This person would take the regular fish oil capsules. How much? At least a minimum of 1,000 milligrams twice a day. If it was my patient, I'd probably double it for a few months. We do what's called a loading dose. So we go up to like 4 grams, but just for 30 days, 60 days, 90 days, just for maybe 3 months. A loading dose of double, so 4 grams, but just for 90 days, then cut it back to the typical 2 grams. Because you don't want to give too much for too long. That's not a good thing. Now on the omega-6 side, this is kind of strange pattern. A couple of high, a normal, and a couple of low. I'm going to end on this thought, then I'm going to open up for questions. So if you're looking at this, well, wait a minute, how could these two be high, and then this one be kind of a little lower, and then these be really low? How could that be happening? Or you might be asking yourself, well, wait a minute, how could ALA be so good, but EPA be low, and then these be even lower? You see that sort of stair-stepping pattern, normal, low, very low. And then over here on the 6s, you've got high, normal, and then low. Okay, wait a minute. Let's think about it. Could you eat in a way that would make that happen? Probably not. So what could that be if it's not diet? Genetics. Why are we even thinking that? Well, look at the pathways. So let me see here. This is where it gets to be kind of fun. Really fun, actually. So in the omega-6 case, I think they had the first couple of these were high, but then there's clearly something wrong with this enzyme here because this one was getting low, and there's clearly something even more wrong with these enzymes here because these are getting lower and lower. So you can see the enzyme defects in the pathways. Do you get that? There's a lot of this, but it's not converting down. That means there's blocks in here. So if you see these two are high, and then there's a block here, then obviously this one would be low. And there's another big block right here, so then these are even lower. So you're seeing the defective enzymes in the stair-stepping process. And you can, if you get really into it, you can figure out which enzyme it is. I don't know, should we do that? Do we have any time? We got like a minute. Let me just show you, just to do this for, because it's kind of fun. So, all right, let's look at where the biggest break is. And then you can calculate which enzyme is messed up. So for example, here, let's look. This is obvious. This one is in the red, and this one is quite a bit lower. There's a huge spread there between GLA and DGLA. There's clearly a block here. This one is not converting down, so GLA to DGLA. So we go back at our handy little chart there, and that's the biggest block that I see just by the distance there. So we go back here, make this a little bigger. Sorry, this thing keeps bouncing around here. I have to do this little display thing. But we just said in this example, and again, this is a wonderful example because it shows it's not all about diet. This person's getting plenty of GLA. Remember, that was high, but DGLA low. So there's a block right here, right there. That's the block. And it's this enzyme, elongase, and it's these cofactors, B3, B5, B6, biotin, and vitamin C. So let me say this one more time. This person's getting plenty of GLA in their diet. And there's a block right here, which is causing the DGLA to be low. So here's the nutrients you could use to fix it. And if you give the person enough GLA and you give them these nutrients, guess what? They're going to start to make these other fatty acids, which are so important for inflammation, immune functioning, and all that good stuff. These are very membranes, cell membranes, I mean, the list goes on. So again, for your nervous system, for your endocrine system, for your digestive tract, everything to do with your brain has to do with fatty acids. Even for things like insulin resistance, these are really key nutrients. All right, so I'm going to pause for a moment and see if there's any questions from the audience. And we're right on the hour, so I think we're right on time.
Hola, gracias. Si tienen alguna pregunta, la pueden poner en el chat y yo la comparto con el doctor. Okay, I'm gonna get started with a couple of questions. Well, first I want to say that we do have the GLA available as well. So we
Good,
have it in Costa Rica as one of our supplements.
perfect.
So always available. Okay, I was going to ask you about the true triglycerides, which is a difference in Designs for Health supplements. And I was going to ask if by using the true triglyceride forms, are we looking into being able to lower the dosages, or is it we keep the same dosages that you have been talking about, 1,000 milligrams BID to 2,000 milligrams BID?
Oh, you still keep the same dosages, yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
We still use the same dosages. And can you speak a little bit on the true triglycerides, so that, because we're mostly used to ethyl esters on products that are commonly sold here in Costa Rica.
And what Designs for Health product are you using exactly?
We're using the Omega Available.
Omega Hypo? Omega Val
No,
Hypo?
no, it's not the hypo. It's the one that has 600 milligrams of EPA and 400 of DHA for 2 capsules.
Okay, let me pull that one up. But I use the Hypo one here, but I think you maybe have different.
Yeah, we
ones.
don't have the hypo.
Okay. And so what's the question then on how to dose this one, or?
Yeah, how to dose this one, and the benefits, so that our doctors know, the benefits of the true triglycerides.
Well,
As
I mean,
opposed to more synthetic forms as ethyl esters, which is what we commonly find in, in medications in Costa Rica.
Oh yeah, we don't have those here at all in any of the professional lines.
No, not in the professional lines.
Yeah, I don't even know how I don't have any experience with the poor quality ones at all. I mean,
Well,
I've never even considered using them.
that's a
So
benefit for you.
yeah, so I don't want to, I'm not sure what to say about those. I just know that no one, like, we don't even think about using them. It's not even on our radar screen.
Yeah, we don't even think about them. We shouldn't think about them. But it's
Well,
one
I'm sure,
thing
I
that,
mean, the problems, I mean, here, I can tell you the problems with fatty acids that are poorly made is they have contaminants. The fish oils have mercury, and so the person gets toxic, and then they're oxidized, they're damaged, like I was saying. And so that's the worst thing you could do. You're dumping a toxin into the body in the form of a heavy metal, and then the fat that's in there is already damaged. That's the whole thing where I was just spent half an hour talking about trying to avoid, right? Because you want to do the opposite. You want to dump in a high quality fatty acid that's undamaged, but even that is risky if you have a high lipid peroxide marker. So if think of it this way, if your body already has oxidation going on and lipids are already being damaged internally, and then you put in a fat that's damaged, that's just the worst idea I could imagine. That is just going to make people sick. That's going to make somebody sick. So even when we're using the good quality fatty acids, you need to be worried about the person's oxidative stress status. So those kind of supplements are just going to make somebody worse in at least 3 or 4 different ways at the same time. It's like that's such a bad idea. That's like dangerous. You would never want to even entertain using those even a little bit. Even if there's no other option, it would be better to use nothing and just have them drink a glass
to use
of water.
nothing.
Yeah. Because we're talking about things that are going to make them actively worse, right? And so you can't. That's one of the hallmarks of being a doctor. It's the whole do no harm model.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So so this characteristic is very important with Designs for Health supplements when it comes to omega-3s. The fact that they are, the true triglycerides, which are highly absorbable, and the way that omega-3s are made in nature. So it's, it's more of a very available, absorbable, bioidentical substance that our bodies can use directly.
Yeah, I mean, I think at least in the States here, we have an assumption that we're all doing that. I mean, this is a complicated job enough. and you can screw things up enough even when you're using good quality ingredients, that if you're using poor quality ingredients, I mean, your business just never gets anywhere because you're not going to have results. Patients aren't going to get better. So, and at least in the colleagues that I've known for the last 30 years, we're kind of forced to use good quality products because we have to get results in order to have referrals for our practices to move forward. And if you're using those kind of poor quality products, patients don't get better, they don't refer, and the whole business model falls apart. So
Exactly.
it's not like an optional thing. And that, I mean, we're doing it because it's a better thing for the patient, but also just from a business perspective, you couldn't run a practice using poor quality products. It would completely fall apart. And within 6 months, you would just be out of business. So you kind of have to, it's required. And as I was mentioning earlier, it's required for Designs for Health to make good quality products, or people like me would, if they change the quality of their fatty acids, my patient practice would start to collapse probably within 6 months, and that would not be a good thing. So we're all kind of trapped in this world together of requiring good quality ingredients because we all need to get results with patients. That's like a minimum requirement. And,
Yeah,
and I would should
absolutely.
back up and say, if you're doing integrative and functional medicine and you're not using the best quality products, then you're not going to get the results that one should. And then you're still going to start to think that the programs don't work. I mean, it could be as simple as something like B6. If you're using a poor quality B6, it's not going to change anything, and the
Yeah,
patient's not going to get better. And so, the patients and the practitioners both start to think that this stuff doesn't work just because they're
exactly.
not using the right things. Yeah.
And B6 is one that we carry as well from Designs for Health. So
Actually,
we have,
B6
yeah.
is really important, and there's a lot of poor quality B6s. We did a little informal research study about 15 years ago, and it was in Duluth, Minnesota, of all places. But we had a group of around 150 patients, and they all needed to take B6, and we were monitoring this with these lab tests, and we sent them out to Duluth, Minnesota to buy B6. And there was one brand from one health food store that worked. The whole rest of the 149 people bought B6 that didn't work, and this one person found this one brand in this one store that actually worked, because you can measure B6 levels on these labs. So again, if you're not using the right quality product, then the business model completely collapses almost immediately.
Yeah, and that is one mindset that we have to, you know, change. And this is why we like to educate our doctors. So, there's the understanding of why we do things the way that should be made.
Yeah.
The other question that I have is when it comes to taking the supplements. So do you recommend to take the fatty acids with meals? And would you rather, use divided doses versus one large dose of omega-3s?
Yeah, in general, fat-soluble nutrients should be taken with food. And obviously the fatty acids are fat-soluble, so you absorb them much better with a meal. It's a little bit better if that meal has some fat in it also, but most meals do. I guess if you're having like some fruit by itself or something, it's maybe no fat in there. But yeah, in general, just with a meal. And it's always better to divide the dosages up. So,
It
typical
is
starting
better
dose,
to divide them.
always, yeah. So one in the morning and
Oh,
one at
really?
night. Yeah.
Oh, excellent. Because,
Unless the person just can't remember, if they ever like never gonna, if they come back after 2 weeks and say, well, I forget every night to take the evening dose or whatever, then, I mean, it's better that they get them in their system.
yeah.
So if they're going to be non-compliant, you can do it once a day. But for almost all the things that we dose, whether it's vitamin D or fish oils or DHEA, it's almost always better to have it divided in terms of absorption.
All right. So it's really, really interesting for us to hear about the importance of the GLA, right? Because when we think about omegas, we're usually thinking about the omegas-3s first and foremost. That is what we usually tend to look for. And omega-6s, at least in my practice, have been more directed towards those vegetarian patients who would not take a fish oil, or the use mainly in hormonal balances for women. So, it's really nice to hear how, we need to use the GLA in most cases. Once that we can get started with the testing, it's going to be a much, much better guide for us. So we'll work on having
Yeah.
this test available.
Yeah, that's exciting.
That is very exciting. All right. Do you think that nutrients like CoQ10, for example, would be good nutrients to take, as foundational supplements?
Yeah, I mean, I take it every day.
You take it every day.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. CoQ10 is one of the ones that we will have, in a short time. We're going through all the law requirements to sell it in the country. So we will have it soon, but we can consider CoQ10 then one of those key nutrients.
Yeah, I mean, it's so versatile. I mean, it's responsible for ATP production and the citric acid cycle and all that stuff in terms of mitochondrial health. But then it's also, like I was showing the image of it, right? It's the fat soluble antioxidant. So it protects your lipids, but it also is responsible for energy production. So it has these multiple roles that are pretty profound. And you use it for what you need it for. You know, if you need it for making energy in the mitochondria, there's where it goes. And if you don't, you can use it as an antioxidant to protect your tissues. So it's cancer protective, protects the brain, protects against cardiovascular disease. It's, I would say, one of the best all-arounder supplements in terms of, you could think of like literally 50 or 100 different things that it helps with. We're seeing really good results with it with long haul COVID because of all the all the vascular inflammation and mitochondrial damage. So yeah, it's a pretty versatile nutrient.
Okay, so in the meantime, because we don't have the testing available, do you think it would be a good idea to supplement our patients with this lipid soluble antioxidants at the same time that we use the omegas? Just to be on the safe side?
Yeah, if you have no testing available, for sure, I would do omega-3s at 1 or 2 grams a day, 1 or 2 capsules a day. Do some either vitamin E or CoQ10 to protect them so that it works well. And then I usually do the omega-6s with diet so that people don't have to take tons of pills. So just give them a list of the foods that are rich in omega-6 and make sure that they have those foods, not every day, but every week. So that'll balance. You will not get into trouble if you do that. So omega-6s are on the diet, omega-3 supplements plus some extra fat soluble antioxidants, and that will not lead to the kind of problems I was talking about.
And what is your preferred form of using flax seeds in your diet?
Well, flaxseed oil is tricky because it goes rancid really quickly. So I'll usually have patients buy the whole flaxseed and then grind it up in a coffee grinder. Every couple of days, they can make their own fresh supply. Because if you buy ground flaxseed, by the time it's been, packaged and sent to you, or you've bought it in a store or whatever, it's going to be rancid. So you just buy the whole flaxseed, and you can eat them whole, or I think it's easier and it tastes better to just grind them up and sprinkle them on something. And usually, typically like a tablespoon a day in a smoothie or on some oatmeal or.
Perfect.
And that's at the top of this pathway here. That's the ALA. Flaxseed is primarily that. So it's that one patient we saw, they had to have it, but because it's at the top of the pathway, it goes down to all the others. So it's quite a versatile one.
And I was thinking as I was looking at those lab results that you were showing, where we had the genetic flaw right there with the elongase enzyme. Do you have the information on how the patient was clinically presenting? What was his?
I don't know. I'd have to go look that one up. I'm not sure, but I can tell you. Let's see. It was GLA. Yeah. So if you don't have, you can kind of tell in general just from looking at the pathway. If the block is right below GLA, it's on the board right now, then you're going to have problems with. I call it. It's a joke, kind of. Not really. It's not very funny because most of my jokes aren't funny, but I call it underinflamed. Because we don't really have a term for it. We're also worried about too much arachidonic acid and too much inflammation from too many omega-6s. Well, that's why a lot of people take omega-3s. But what if in this patient's case, you don't have enough arachidonic acid? We don't really even have a construct for that. But you would not have enough inflammation. You would not have enough of these eicosanoids. right? And so those people tend to get really, really tired.
So it wouldn't be a positive thing for us to see that low of arachidonic acid on a test.
No, you need it. You need it. And that's what I got that one thing back here. I kind of skipped over it, but it's one slide here. I know, because it's very easy for the human brain to sort of classify things as good or bad. I mean, we do this with people, we do this with whole countries and religions, you know, like that's a good
yeah,
one.
that's true.
You do it with omega-3s and omega-6s. So 3s are good and 6s are bad, but here, this back here.
Because, you know, that's the first thing that I thought is, well, he's fortunate with very low levels of arachidonic acid.
No, here.
Less inflammation.
It's this slide back here. Sorry, it's way at the beginning. You can have not enough inflammation.
Okay.
That is the key. Oh, wait a minute. Where did it go? That is one of the big, here it is, this one. This gets screwed up. So prostaglandins, leukotrienes, all these things, if you don't have, and this kind of describes it here, dietary intake can alter the fatty acid composition of cell membrane, blah, 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 blah. Each polyunsaturated fatty acid precursor gives rise to a variety of molecules with a range of immune modulating activities. Inflammatory are red, anti-inflammatory blue, pro-resolving green. And all this on the omega-6 side would get screwed up if you don't have enough of that. It's anything that you think about regarding prostaglandins, leukotrienes, all that. So, but we don't have, like I said earlier, we don't have like a model for what that means. But when you see it in a patient, they're going to not sleep well, they're going to be just exhausted, and they get really, really anxious, and their immune system collapses.
Which is what our patients commonly consult for. You know,
and they're not inflamed. Okay, they're not inflamed necessarily, but they have a lot of other problems that are pretty severe.
Okay, and one more question, just one more. When it comes to when we were talking about the contraindications or the, you know, the, what is it called, the interactions between drugs and nutrients. So anticoagulant medications, are they an absolute contraindication for the use of omega-3s?
Well, that's a really good question. This is how I look at it, but everybody has to come up with their own opinion for this. It seems basic and commonsensical to just restore normal physiology and normal function. So you can use a nutrient like an omega-3 as a drug-like effect. Like if your omega-3 levels are normal and you take omega-3s, it can make your depression go away. But it's not making your depression go away because you were deficient. It's making your depression going away because the omega-3s have a drug-like effect on the brain, just like an antidepressant would. But separately from that, you can also use a nutrient to replace what's missing in the body. And so if your omega-3s are outright low, I mean, just to bring them up to normal seems pretty important. And that's different than using them in a high dose long-term in a drug-like effect, which would lead to problems with, you know, some drug supplement interaction. So in other words, getting the levels back to normal, I cannot see how that could be harmful for someone. However, you have to be really careful. So you might have to do it with food, or you might have to do it with really low dosages of supplements so they don't interfere. And there's, again, that book, the Drug Nutrient Handbook, Drug Nutrient Interaction Handbook, can kind of guide you through some of that. But I think that if you're replacing a deficiency, if you're concerned about it, I would just do it with food, because no one's going to get, you know, a problem from eating too much salmon or something like that, right?
Meaning not supplementing, but dietary sources of omegas.
Yeah, if you're worried about it, you can do it with dietary sources. Or you can just keep the dosages really, really low. And then as soon as you run a follow-up lab and the omega-3s are normal, then you would stop. So in this model of lab testing, we have two different ways we can go. You can use the omega-3s until the omega-3s are normal on the lab and then stop. Or even after you've achieved that, you might want to use the omega-3s additionally to relieve depression or to relieve inflammation. Like I have a lot of patients that are inflamed, and we give them the omega-3s, even though their omega-3 levels are fine on the test, because they have an anti-inflammatory effect. But then you're using that supplement like a drug versus using it to replace something that's missing. So it's two different, entirely different uses of the same product.
Okay, and now it's going to be the last question. But this
Okay.
panel, this lab that we're talking about, like what you presented today, it will show us other nutrient deficiencies, correct? Besides omegas.
Oh yeah, we were looking at maybe 10% of the lab. It does all the amino acids, all the organic acids. It's a beast of a test. Yeah, there's a lot to it. So the fatty acids are maybe 1 page out of 10, so maybe 10% of it.
All right, perfect.
Yeah.
So I think we have no more questions for tonight.
Excellent. Well, thank you for hosting. I very much appreciate it.
Oh yeah, thank you for teaching us. It's always wonderful. It's always wonderful, and I'm sure that we have all learned a lot, especially how to help more our clients, which is what we need to learn. So we will have the presentation available for us to distribute among our doctors, and we have the recording as well. And then you and I can keep in touch via email for certain questions that might come up, and that we get in contact with the lab. That'd be wonderful.
Okay, that sounds really good.
All right. So thank you everyone for joining us tonight, and we will be in touch. Thank you so much. Okay, bye-bye.